And let me introduce you to the first keynote speaker, Camilla Bausch of the Ecologic Institute. Camilla, apart from being the great leader of think tank that she is, before that she was a long-standing member of the German delegation to the UN climate negotiations. Camilla, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Céline. Thank you. All right, welcome again to everybody. Our event shows how the EU comes together and the world comes together in the shared wish to create pathways to a climate-proof future. We come together with the means of digital technologies, which actually allows us to come together with a relatively low carbon footprint. However, when we started planning for this event, obviously we had a very different event in mind. We wanted to invite you to the wonderful city of Berlin, my hometown, and we wanted to present this city which proudly shows the healed scars of its unification, and where one can still marvel at its peaceful coming together. It's a city where it's shown that how people can change the world when they are devoted to a same cause, when they come together to really fight for this. But the reunification of Germany also shows how difficult a change process can be and how long it can take. Now, today, Berlin within Germany is a hotspot for COVID-19. The virus forces us to think anew, to change our ways. The pandemic has caused thousands of tragedies and death. We send today all our heartfelt wishes for a speedy and complete recovery to those suffering from the virus, and our heartfelt condolences to those who have lost loved ones. Now, in the times of the pandemic, we also feel the restrictions of our freedoms, the economic challenges, and the many insecurities. Just a few days ago, the EU Commission stated in its economic forecast that the pandemic will have very severe economic and social consequences. The EU economy is predicted to contract by 7% this year. And while it is expected to pick up speed again and grow in 2021, the unemployment rates will not only rise this year, but also in the year to come. Many countries face similar challenges or even more severe impacts. People are working hard to overcome this economic crisis, the repercussions, the health crisis. They try to understand what it means for our economies, for our societies, and our way of life. Across Europe, the pandemic has also shown how, as societies, we can change on short notice. It has shown that it is possible to overcome political and economic hurdles in the united determination to find solutions. It has underscored the importance of scientific advice to policymaking. However, it has also shown our weaknesses, the fragility of our systems, the risks of falling back into nationalistic patterns, the vulnerability of the weak and marginalized groups in our societies. Insights and experience are relevant for our efforts to address also other crises, not least the environmental crisis like biodiversity loss or climate change. We must integrate the ongoing changes, insights, as well as the opportunities related to the billions of euros of recovery money in our response to these crises. At our conference, we will focus on the climate crisis and its many dimensions. And this is urgent. Many of us will have experienced unusual droughts, storms, and heat waves in the last month or years. After 2 unusually dry summers, of the 440,000 trees lining the streets of Berlin, 1 in 3 shows serious signs of damage due to the droughts. Indeed, scientific predictions are turning reality at an alarming rate. Just recently, measurements by researchers from Peking University and the University of Ohio State confirmed the Gulf Stream, the very heartbeat of the ocean, is slowing down. Of course, in the Paris Agreement, the world came together and committed to stay well below 2-degree global temperature increase and pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, the most recent UNEP-GAP report of 2019 warns us, and I quote, "Countries collectively failed to stop the growth in global greenhouse gas emissions. There is no sign of greenhouse gas emissions peaking in the next few years." The report warns us, every year postponed peaking means that deeper and faster cuts will be required. So now it is evident, as it has been before, action is needed urgently, it's needed now. The GAP report also points to several opportunities, as do many other scientific publications. It shows opportunities also for Europe, including, for example, to refrain from investments in fossil fuel infrastructure, to step up efforts to phase out coal-fired power plants, and to define a strategy for zero emissions industrial processes. Now, and we can look at some positive developments as well. There are advances in technology and business. Just think about the plummeting prices of renewable energies, the soaring investments in this field. Think about the new business models which emerge around storage or around electric mobility. Think about the debates on the impacts of the climate crisis at the World Economic Forum, or successful divestment movements and increasing awareness of climate risk management in the financial sector. Overall, this is also driven by a groundswell of public pressure, as the future generations are taking to the street and remind the governments that they might lose public support if they don't act on climate. There are promising elements and moments also in the policy arena. Just think of the new US president-elect, who is willing to re-engage in climate policy and promising to make the US the carbon neutral by 2050. With this, President-elect Biden is actually joining a huge chorus around the world. In Europe, Ursula von der Leyen made the European Green Deal her flagship project. She, as a conservative, made the climate crisis the leading topic of her political agenda. With the ambition of systemic change and the aim of sustainable growth and leadership, she wants to build an economy, and I quote, that is sustainable, cleaner, safer, and healthier. Indeed, von der Leyen wants to make Europe the first carbon neutral continent on this planet. Despite the pandemic, the EU Commission stuck to the European Green Deal, and that in and of itself is already an achievement, because of course there were voices who called for a watering down of the ambition or delay in action. A sweep of policy action is going on or is to be expected, for example, on biodiversity, on circular economy, pollution, financing, and industrial policy. In the next 15 months, we can expect a wave of regulatory action. For example, the decision on an increased EU 2030 climate target, a revision of the EU emissions trading scheme, work on the Energy Efficiency Directive, the Renewable Energy Directive, the performance standards of cars, the LULUCF regulation. We can expect proposals to revise the Energy Taxation Directive, as well as a review of the state aid guidelines. And I'll stop here for the sake of time. Now, the key question is, will all of this action taken together actually be enough to deliver on Europe's high ambition, a strong, climate neutral and resilient Europe, as a global example on how prosperity, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability can be reconciled? How likely is it that the broad overarching vision of the European Green Deal will translate into sufficient progress on the ground in all the various processes and dossiers into which it has to be translated? Will the EGD develop enough momentum to overcome the resistance of incumbents with their vested interests and fears, as well as the inertia of processes and institutions? Can it be successful considering the tight timeline? As admittedly, many of the policy areas are not really that new, we also have to ask ourselves, why did it not succeed in the past? Why is it still so challenging? And what is different now? Now, there are three differences that make me cautiously hopeful. The first one is that for the first time, a carbon-proof future is the guiding principle for all policy action. It is not seen merely as an annex to other policies, and especially not in an antagonistic relationship, for example, to economic or industrial policy, but it is a systemic driver for innovation and economic stability. This is backed by economic trends and innovation, which I just have outlined. Second, there has never been as much urgency as today, and the science and measurements confirm this. People can actually feel it. And this is maybe also one reason why, thirdly, there is a solid support for action. The Eurobarometer poll of 2019 actually said that 92% of respondents and more than 8 in 10 in each member state agree that greenhouse gas emissions should be reduced to a minimum while offsetting the remaining emissions in order to make the EU economy carbon neutral by 2050. But despite this, success will not come easy. One example that shows that actually in a painful fashion is the current status of the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy. The European Environmental Bureau just recently called this status, and I quote, strongly undermining the EGD, quote end. This shows how difficult change can be when incumbents push to maintain the status quo. It shows how difficult it is to translate the EGD ambition and targets into real action on the ground. There are great obstacles we have to overcome. We face complex systemic challenges and we need systemic solutions. We have to translate them into everyday practices and into new business models. We have to help those on the ground who can and want and should make the change happen to make it happen. We have for this to combine social, economic, technological, and political innovation, power, creativity, and change. This is why we come together for the next 2 days. We have assembled shapers and pioneers from science, from policymaking, from business and civil society. Together, and only together, can we identify promising pathways to this climate neutral, resilient, and sustainable future. Together, we can advance our collective thinking and create new ideas to make the EGD a pathway to a future we want to live in. Thank you for joining us in this endeavor and enjoy the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Camilla, for this first really very inspiring opening speech for our conference of Think 2030. And now I will turn to Hans Bruyninckx. Hans Bruyninckx doesn't really need any introduction. Obviously, everyone knows that he's the executive director of the European Environmental Agency. He's also, you know, the most passionate, but also evidence-based advocate for Europe's environment. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Céline, and thank you for the invitation to speak at the Think 2030 conference. And of course, happy birthday to Ecologic Institute. Well, when I think of the 2030 and the policy agenda that we have in front of us, I of course start from a knowledge perspective, as that is the key mandate of the European Environment Agency. And if we start from the scientific basis, I think indeed we have every reason to focus on a very strong 2030 agenda. It's not without reason that we talk in science about a pivotal decade, and it's of no use in this expert audience to mention the IPCC work talking about a 1.5 degree, but also to realize that we're actually more on a trajectory of 3 to 4 degrees. I would also like to emphasize the IPBES work in preparation also of the UNCBD conference and the International Resource Panel work, and they all speak about the same type of messaging. We are in an interconnected set of crises of planetary systems. We are already seeing tipping points, and in some cases it is 12. Climate change is happening. We've lost a large number of species, and so we really need to understand that a systemic response here is necessary. I would also like to add that if you look at a global level, there is also a health and an inequality perspective, which I think have to be brought to the table. Second point is that I think all of this refers to a fundamental crisis in the relationship between Homo sapiens and the natural systems or system Earth. You could call this a lost equilibrium. So the real fundamental question from a scientific perspective is towards what sort of new equilibrium are we going, and what is the role of Homo sapiens to come to that equilibrium and in that new situation. That is, of course, looking very far ahead, but I think in the end, that's what we are talking about. Then the European Green Deal is obviously a response. It is the European response to this sort of scientific and knowledge basis. And I think it is beyond any doubt the most ambitious, most forward-looking, most integrated, fundamental, and courageous policy project that Europe has ever formulated. It is actually setting it very clear, or putting it very clear, that the boundary conditions of the 21st century to be a healthy society and to function on a European continent with people having a job and a good health and a happy life is rather different. It is now about organizing this within the limits of the planet, which was, by the way, the long-term vision in the 7th Environment Action Programme, but is now more deeply embedded in the European Green Deal and taken up in the 8th Environment Action Programme. I think many of us have maybe been a bit surprised how corona resilient this European Green Deal is, and I would say even more, it is one of the core drivers and building blocks of growing out of this corona economic situation as well. Now, if you look back a bit, it is part of a change that actually started in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, the Circular Economy Package, the Climate and Energy Package, and of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is where I have a first sort of fundamental reflection. You could say that this is a change that came fast, 5 years' time, landing in such an ambitious European Green Deal. But of course, from a knowledge perspective, it's a change that has been very slow, because a lot of the fundamental knowledge going into this finds its foundation in the 1970s, Limits to Growth, Club of Rome. If you go at the founding of UNEP and you go to the basic documents there, a lot of the stuff that we talk about today is already mentioned there. And then, of course, I want to link it to the Rio conference in '92, where if you read Agenda 21 and you modernize the language, we already had SDGs. And we are now 28 years past Agenda 21, past the Rio conference. And we still haven't bended the trends of unsustainability. So a critical question is, what are we going to do radically different in the next decade that we apparently haven't done in the last 2.5 decades? And that is where I think the European Green Deal has to be realized, while critically reflecting on a couple of elements that we learned from studying sustainability transitions. And of course, transitions and sustainability are core elements of the European Green Deal. Now, let me first look at a number of positive elements. First of all, I think this is by far the most systemic view that Europe has ever formulated, and it is also reflected in portfolios. First Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans has, on the one hand, climate, biodiversity, oceans in his portfolio and responsibility. That's the outcome that we want to see changed. But he also has what I would call the drivers in terms of production and consumption system, agriculture, energy, and transport. Bringing those together, I think, is a governance perspective that we have not seen before. Secondly, we are now setting targets and putting forward targets in Europe that in principle exclude the continued focus on efficiency gains in technologies or solutions that we already have. If you put forward minus 55% or the Parliament's discussion minus 60%, you exclude that we keep meddling in the margins or keep focusing on technologies and solutions that we have. They point to the necessity of systemic change. Thirdly, I think the element of long-term view, the fact that we have a vice president, Mr. Šefčovič, who is specialized and responsible with his team in foresight, which goes beyond modeling, is I think very critical. And then finally, the link to the financial system is of course equally fundamental, because if we want radically different outcomes in a system which Americans call capitalism, we call it the market economy, it would be very strange to expect that without talking about one of the very core elements of our systems of production and consumption, which is the role of capital and finance. So I would never underestimate the very explicit choices that Europe is making there and the impact that that can have on the whole discussion. But I would also like to emphasize that we need to focus on a number of elements that are a bit less comfortable, that you could call disruptive. And first of all, it means that we need to recognize that we not only need to scale up solutions, but focus more than ever on speeding up solutions. Sustainability outcomes are possible, but increasingly windows are closing. So speeding up has to become a critical point of attention. That means, in my opinion, that we should start reflecting much more on what we should stop doing in the short term, what we should phase out, to create the space for a faster breakthrough of sustainable solutions, not only in technology, also in business models, in societal change. That I think is absolutely critical. And we don't necessarily like to do that in institutional settings. This means that we need to reflect on or analyze, where are the blocking forces? Where are the mechanisms that hold us back to come with the change that we know the direction of? Often we know the technologies, often we know that this makes economic sense, and often we know that this can lead to better societies. So where are the path dependencies? Where are the lock-in mechanisms? And how do we break through them? It also means that we might have to discuss difficult topics which are often not on the table. Consumption, for example. How do we address this? Or the cost of inaction. And I don't only mean the economic cost, but also the environmental and societal cost. Yeah. At the most fundamental level, I think it means stepping away from a concept of sustainability, which we have all grown up with, and that is sustainable development is where economic, social, and environmental issues are in a balance and we move forward. I think this will not suffice. I think we need to recognize that natural capital, biodiversity, ecosystems, our system Earth is in fact the financial capital on which we can build healthy societies for which we need enabling economies. And that is putting a lot of decision making actually upside down. I think this means that we also need the courage to step away from what I call optimistic generalizations. Yeah, that we hear so often without much substantiation in many cases. And that is, for example, the fact that we should continue to focus on learning from best practices. And of course, that is true. But I think we need to also look at best practices of how we can phase out quickly of what we should stop doing. We often also hear that consumers will be the change makers. If only the consumer would buy different goods, we would be producing different goods. Well, really, is that how it works? Maybe we should not individualize responsibility, but rather focus on how citizens, in a context where they expect stronger institutional responses, are facilitated to make a specific type of choices than as consumers. And by the way, expecting consumers to be the solution without addressing consumption seems a bit bizarre as well. The idea that business is ahead of policy, we've heard that now for a decade and a half. I am not ignoring or denying that many businesses are indeed part of innovation and part of the front runners, but we need to be serious about coming with strong uh, governance frameworks that actually drive that innovation and reward those who are ahead much more. So those are a number of fundamental things. If I reflect then briefly on the role of knowledge in this type of context, yeah, I think it is clear that we will need to go to knowledge in support of sustainability transitions. And that means actionable knowledge. Knowledge that is not only analyzing what is happening, but also comes with an explicit link to how we can mobilize the forces of change and overcome those who are trying to hold back. More integrated knowledge, systemic analyses, finally taking the debate of beyond GDP to a place where it has impact on political and other decisions, and integrated impact assessments at the level of the EU that are institutionalizing this complete concept of sustainability transitions. Also more up-to-date knowledge. We have the technology, but it's often not embedded in our legislation. And increasingly also a more critical discussion about the role of digitalization, which is used by some as a panacea. And I think it can contribute if we have a strong, I would say, European stamp on digitalization, which means with strong transparency, a strong link to sustainability, and a strong systemic interaction with an SDG perspective. In conclusion, I would say, yes, the European Green Deal and the emphasis on climate is the most optimistic place where we've been for this agenda. So if not now, when? But climate change will have to be dealt with together with biodiversity, resources, health, and a societal perspective that gives hope to everybody in Europe and not just to a few or a couple of regions in Europe. And secondly, and final sentence, I think we need to focus fundamentally on what can scale up and speed up increasingly systemic sustainability transitions. And that is not only focus on what we should be doing in terms of solutions, but also what we should stop doing in terms of what is hampering a speedy breakthrough of the good way forward. Thank you very much, and happy to be in this conference with all of you.
Thank you so much, Hans, for this inspiring speech. You've always been a supporter of Think2030. You were there at our first conference, and I think you're challenging us again to really produce actionable knowledge to move beyond sustainable development, I mean the comfortable side of sustainable development, to resist the temptation of individualizing responsibility, to have the courage to talk about consumption, phasing out the brown economy, rewarding front runners through regulation, but also resisting the digital mirage. So thanks a lot for all of this. And now I'm going to turn to our next speaker. I'm very honored to introduce Dr. Klaus Töpfer. He's a legend. He's had a distinguished career, obviously being the director of UNEP and also as a minister. And now he's the founding partner of TMG, a think tank that is part of the Think Sustainable Europe network. Klaus, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really honored. There were already two wonderful keynote speeches, so what can I do? I can only make some remembrance. And I want to start, if you give the first floor, the next, yeah, wonderful. I think we can see that this year 2020 is really a terrible year, annus horribilis, as the old Latin people would say it. We see catastrophes and we see disasters. We see the pandemic. Next slide, please. We see the corona pandemic. Only yesterday, more than 1,000 citizens of the United States of America died on this pandemic. We have more than 1 million deaths. Of course, you can go on and see that this is the whole year demanding topic without any doubt, and I'm fairly sure that we will have a lot to do also next year with this pandemic. Next slide, please. We have the climate change. The global emissions are still on a historic height. Of course, what we succeeded to decrease to some extent was more or less linked with the first disaster, with the corona pandemic. Because if you have a shutdown, a lockdown situation, the CO2 emissions are decreasing as well, and that's what we learned too. So it is without any doubt that there are lots of disastrous development in this field. We see it with the forest fires, we see it with the floods, we see it, of course, also in the fact, and Hans mentioned the financial situation as well, that there's a 100 billion US dollars once made as a proposal for the developing world are far from being realized, So we see it is a disaster as well. Next slide. We see those topics like the locust disaster in Africa, with a lot of hunger problems coming on in this structure. You can go on and on with the disasters in this annus horribilis 2020. By the way, also with regard to the election of the American president, please don't forget that more than 72 million American citizens elected a person who was far from accepting any insight in climate change with regard to scientific findings. 72 million in the United States, that is really a huge topic, and it is broken in the whole society there. And I'm not sure that if we have the one or the other discussion here, there will be also quite some surprise in this field too. You can go on and on in these annus horribilis. And therefore, you know, I'm fairly old. I was quite a long time, as you may remember, responsible for UNEP. And when I started there and left it later, we made some little signals where we are in this world. Next slide. Also, to come back to my Latin experience, repetitio est mater sapientia, repetition is the mother of wisdom. So I went in my old files and I asked, what was the situation in the world in those days when I had the responsibility in Nairobi for UNEP with regard, for example, if you see the population. Next slide, please. Old pictures, you all know them. You know that Africa is much, much bigger and that Asia is a huge world, that the Americas are slimming. By the way, that would be a good recommendation to quite a number of people in North America for slimming. And you see the other parts. I cannot go into detail. I have 15 or 20 minutes. So this is, by, I hope, self-explanatory. This was only not yet 20 years ago, this situation. If you go now and see the same with regard to the per capita income, next slide, please. This is a world with a capital income. This changed to some extent, especially with regard to China, as you see. And you know that already yesterday, we had this new Asia-Pacific countries trade agreement, quite a contradictory to the America First policy, the North American situation. And it is not only America First. We are in a huge crisis of multilateralism in a time where we need multilateralism more than ever. And if you see Western Europe as it is in this economic situation, you see Africa on the other side. And you know that the population in Africa will increase until the middle of this century to 2 billion. And Europe will stay more or less in the same situation. You see that we have some problems in front of us, which are not always touched. We try to make not the wall as Trump tried to do it with Mexico. But if you go a little bit with your fantasy, you see a lot of comparable topics with regard to the interrelation between Africa and Europe. And this is not the end, it is a beginning. And I believe I strongly recommend that we should consider also in Europe what is going on in our neighbor. The closest part between Africa and Europe are 14 kilometers, only to mention it once more. And we will not overcome a freedom and a democratic system in Europe if we cannot handle the fact that only some days before, again, nearly 100 people tried to come to Europe and they were losing their lives in the waters of the Mediterranean. This is a little bit the situation. Therefore, repetition is the mother of wisdom. We have to remember that this is the world we are living in. And this is a world where we have also to be considered, because until this middle of this century, the world will go up to 9 billion people. When I was born, it was 2.5 billion people. And Europe was a totally other share in this population as it is now. So if you don't have this in mind and ask what is our obligations as Europeans in this field, I think then we are making really big mistakes. We have to come back to much more multilateralism. The multilateralism system cannot find its end at the borders of Europe. If we want to do this, we will have a very, very bad situation for the climate policy in the future. Therefore, please remember this. Next slide. I only want to repeat my good old boss, Kofi Annan. Unluckily, he passed away much too early. Welfare based on the destruction of the environment is not means real welfare. It is at best a short-term elimination of the tragedy. I cannot underline it again and again, and wherever I have to discuss, where I have to deliver a speech in my country, in Germany or where else, these are the information we have to translate, that the people are not convinced that they have only to be interested in their perspectives, but also going beyond that. Next slide, please. So what is the consequence on this field? We have the disasters. We need a lot of investment to overcome this disaster in coronavirus. Camilla mentioned, by the way, congratulations to 25 years, also to Andreas. I know that is not an easy way, 25 years. So I have to add, I'm 55 years married with the same wife, so I have some ideas that 25 is not so much. But nevertheless, congratulations, and for the next 25, best wishes. So we have to invest in the coronavirus. And honestly, if somebody had informed me 2 years before that we will have a 3-digit billion program for the green revolution, I would say, please, you are fever or what's the matter? Now we have money, money, money. We have a new theory in money theory. Money is available. Money is in a huge dimension available. So we have to invest in any case. We have to invest to overcome this disaster, to revitalize the economic growth. I wouldn't believe that Camilla would ever ask for increase of the economy in this way as she did it in her introducing statements. So we have to do it. We have to come for jobs. You know that Biden mentions this wonderful sentence, when I think about climate change, I think about jobs. That is the normal speech of investment with double dividend. Invest in the overcoming of the corona crisis disaster and try to make it in a way that this is also helpful, not only helpful, it is stimulating the green growth, the green economy we urgently need. I don't believe that without corona, we would have the same financial flexibility we have quite now. Therefore, we have to do our utmost to make this investment productive in investment. And I come back a little bit more in detail on this topic. Next slide, please. So we have on the one side, the first part, the economic stabilization. And here we have a lot of interrelation to the Green Deal. You know, 30 years ago, I was a minister here in Germany, and we started as the first nation in the world, the life cycle economy. We made the life cycle economy law. Now, 30 years later, it is again on the agenda. We lost more or less 30 years. And we know that we cannot reach our climate targets without having a circular economy. If you see the need for the different materials, raw materials, what is going on with cobalt, what is going on with lithium, what is going on with copper, how can we handle batteries without having answers to those topics, without giving a huge push to the life cycle economy. It is absolutely necessary to go in this direction. Otherwise, we will have a lot of additional problems. We see coming the development of the bioeconomy. How do we handle it? Unluckily, bioeconomy is not even mentioned. Unluckily, agriculture is really not mentioned in all this, what we have to discuss. If you see the budget of the European Union quite now, you see that we have still the open situation with regard to the agricultural agenda and the financing of the agricultural agenda. All this is, I believe, linked with the economic stabilization in this continent and beyond. And therefore, I want to underline it once more. Europe, and I come back to this, has a specific responsibility in this also beyond the European. The second topic, next slide, please. The second part of the double dividend is sustainable green economy. And you know, there was this famous Austrian economist, Josef Schumpeter. He formulated the principle of the creative destruction. Yes, we need the destruction of the old to have a new path for the future. But to link this with stability seems me to be a very, very important part without any doubt. What is the link? Next slide, please. Technology. And I ask myself, what are the criteria for the technology we need? You know, when I was asked to go to Africa a long time ago at the beginning of this century, I was in Germany also responsible for nuclear power. And I was convinced that this is a perspective for the world. Then you are in Africa. And then you see, do you want really to develop Africa with the huge technology as nuclear power? No, you need error-friendly technology. We need this as well. We saw that technologies who are not allowed to have a mistake are not the perspective for sustainability in the future with 9 and 10 billion people on this globe. So we need a globalization-able technology. We needed mistake, error-friendly. You can change it. And that is also the precondition to have it more decentralized. And you must have it open technologies for the participation of the citizen. It must be very closely to democracy-friendly developments. So you have here 5 of those criteria. What are the need of new technologies here? Therefore, I have always my question mark if I see that we are discussing now a little bit beyond the absolutely knowledge of the technologies, even up to hydrogen. Is that all linked with those technology necessities, or is it not? How can we make it democracy friendlier? How we can do it in a much more participatory mood? If we want to be with a perspective for the open, democratic, parliamentarian democracy, I believe we really need much more direct participation element in the democracy that is linked with sustainability in the future. So I believe that we have to be aware of this. You can go in other topics as well. I give you one example. We are discussing more the so-called deep sea mining. It is absolutely not globalization able. It is not eco-friendly. It is not open for participation and democracy friendly. There are only some 5, 6, 8 nations in the world who are in the technical situation to make this happen. Why can we not integrate this already in the development of technologies? And once more, I'm not so sure that we have the openness to society quite now. I repeat, 72 million American voters voted for a person who was everything but not science-oriented. It was a fake news situation, and it is still a fake news situation. We see that there are Verschwörungstheorien, theories for fantasy, but lots of people are going. We have those demonstrations in Leipzig on the streets. We have it all over the world that the people are protesting against what is done with regard to the handling of the Pandora crisis. So we must be very, very aware that we need also mistake-friendly technologies so that we can also change with new knowledge, with new insights in the construction pattern of nature and life. I believe a very important part, and I can go in all the direct link. One example to this, we always say that we have also the digitalization, link it to environment. The mobility of people and the situation in cities are changing with digitalization. Until now, the demand of the consumers is mobile. They go with their car to the big marketplaces outside of the cities. Now the supply is mobile and goes to the people. Delivery services is substituting mobility, and it is changing the structure of cities, the center cities, and you can see it already now. And I don't believe that this is going away when Corona is not going away, but it hopefully is handled in a reliable way so that we can have a little bit the same situation as we have it before. So to combine digitalization and, for example, in this case, mobility seems me to be absolutely necessary. You see it as well with regard to the home office development. We don't have now to have all those people running to their offices in the cities. They are much more at home. They are substituting again mobility against the movement, against the situation to stay at home and work there. I believe a very, very important example, the question of demand mobility or supply mobility, is the question of the offices in centralized office buildings, or a little bit more and more with regard to the private office at home, and to be linked with what we see here, that even a person like myself is able to make such a presentation with all this. Let me come to an end and mention, next slide please, that behavioral change, I forgot it nearly, but I mentioned it already. I believe that was the topic of my situation with mobility. Next slide, please. Next slide, yeah.
Klaus,
No, this one,
One
yeah.
minute.
At the end of the day, you see, we are always considered that we are still in a nature society, that Holocene is still what we have to handle. If you see what Paul Crutzen, Nobel Prize laureate, still alive, good friend of mine, he delivered this wonderful contribution to Nature in 2002 under the headline, The Geology of Mankind. And he comes to the conclusion that a daunting task lies ahead of scientists and engineers to guide the populations through the area of the Anthropocene, the man-made world. And he comes to the conclusion that might also involve climate engineering. We have the passive climate engineering, very, very good to have it. The landscape change, afforestation, but others are already feeding and sinking the feeding of the oceans. But there's also solar radiation management under discussion. That's in front of us. It is not mentioned in the Green Deal. But we have to be aware, if we want not only to run after the development, but want to be in the driver's seat, then we should also come at the end of the day to the question, what is the role of mankind in the Anthropocene, where he is a quasi-geological force, and where what is he doing is also for the highest importance on the past dependencies of decisions later, so that this is something like a burden or a limitation for an open society, for open democracy, where you need alternatives for the future. We are going in a situation where we reduce the alternatives, and therefore we are reducing freedom, and we are reducing participation in the policy and in the societal life. Thank you very much. Next slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Töpfer, for reminding us that we are indeed in the Anthropocene, and that there is an absolute need to shape innovation in a way that it delivers sustainability rather than further damage. I think this is chiming in quite well with what we are getting from the chat. I just wanted to say a few things from the chat. There was quite a lot of discussion about how do we make sure that we don't transfer the burden of transition to other regions. And again, the problem of lithium is mentioned by participants. Someone is also asking, you know, net zero, are we simply not giving up on bringing down the emissions and dreaming of a perfect carbon capture and storage. Others are also warning us against the win-win discourse and the fact that it is time indeed to talk about how we take away blockers and how we challenge the religion of the economy. Some are even daring to talk about the disaster of the common agricultural policy. And then also some suggestions that we should and could build a common energy and climate policy. So it's almost the time for our first break. I really wanted to thank very much our keynote speakers, so Hans, Camilla, and Klaus. In terms of what's happening next, you can leave the Zoom open. We will have a 15-minute break, so feel free to refill your coffee and tea and get ready for the next session that will start at 2:15. And the other thing is, if you don't know what to do, you can also go on Whova and answer the poll. You will see that we have 3 questions for you. So thank you very much again, and see you at 2:15.